Hi. In the final conversation for this season, I'd like to speak from the perspective of someone who has given or someone who has administered a medical writing test to an aspiring medical writer and also developed a checklist of things that need to be met in order to consider that piece as something which is acceptable, in order to consider that writing sample as something which meets the requirements for us to move forward with the interviewing process. So today I'd like to share a few bullet points from my checklist on what we look for when we receive feedback after having sent out a medical writing assessment. So the first thing that we look for is, as far as key points are concerned, when we send out a clinical paper, we look for information on the endpoints. If the primary and secondary endpoints have been met, that needs to be clearly spelled out, and we look for that. We also look for information on how the safety aspects of a clinical trial have been described. If there's an accurate summary of safety, that's certainly something which is another checkbox on the checklist. And the third, of course, is a drawback. Drawbacks are sometimes very clearly spelled out in the clinical literature. Sometimes it takes a little bit of reading and a little bit of reading between the lines in order to find out what the drawback of this product or what the drawback of this treatment or therapy really is. So drawback is also something which forms another checkbox on the checklist. Moving down, we also look at statistics. Every statement in a clinical write-up, in a clinical abstract, for instance, has to be backed up with the appropriate statistical data. If the word significant is used, there has to be a p-value associated with it along with the confidence interval. If words such as insignificant or irrelevant are used, then there has to be appropriate statistical data within parentheses in order to justify that statement. So that's something else which we look for. So it's not really just putting together prose and sentences to create a smooth flow, but it's also finding a way of including statistics at very specific places in order to justify the scientific value of what's being written. That's the next point. We also look for sentence structure. Now moving along from more of the scientific and medical aspects to the writing aspects, clear flowing sentence structure and the appropriate use of simple sentences. That's very important. We also look at length considerations. One thing which is important is anytime we send out a writing assessment, we make it very clear as to how long it should be. If it's 500 words, it's clearly spelled out. And we also tell aspiring medical writers and applicants to write down how many words the article contains at the bottom of the article. So we have that number, and that's one of the first things we look at before even reviewing the article as to whether or not the word limit has been met, because following the word limit discipline is just so crucial, not only to medical writing, but all sorts of science writing as well. And finally, one of the other things we look at is whether the right audience is being addressed. We make it very clear who the audience is. I would say a majority of the writing tests which I have given out to aspiring medical writers have mostly focused on writing for an MSL audience or perhaps healthcare providers, and rarely sometimes for a general audience, but mostly focused on scientific audiences. So that's another thing on the checklist as well, to make sure that every sentence, every paragraph is catered to the same audience consistently. So think about these points. Let me just repeat them once more. Endpoints, safety and drawbacks of a trial, statistics to justify data, sentence structure, length, and finally making sure that it impacts, that it's going out to the right audience. So think about that, and all the best.